Since we've been dealing with fractions, my introduction will be that I'm 2/3 of a legal studies professor here at the University of Illinois, Springfield, and I'm 1/3 a lawyer with the Innocence Project, which is also housed here at UIS. I'm not going to talk to you about Lerone Bennett. I'm not going to even talk to you about Lincoln. I'm going to talk to you about Edith Sampson, who I'm pretty sure Lerone Bennett did not like, and what she and many African-American women activists thought of their emancipation during the Centennial of the Emancipation Proclamation. There were national and local events commemorating the Centennial. It was at the urging of black male leaders in Chicago, that the Illinois General Assembly established the American Negro Emancipation Centennial Commission of Illinois. It's a mouthful. The purpose was to plan, quote, an American program designed to give new meaning and relevance to the Emancipation Proclamation and its significance for the times. All right, so the times, the early 1960s, featured a nation involved in a Cold War and on the verge of domestic upheaval. The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union included attempts by both countries to influence the form of government adopted by the newly decolonized countries in Asia and Africa. And the looming domestic upheaval was prompted in part by the new strategies that the civil rights movement was putting in place, transitioning from patience and gradualism to impatience and direct action. The upheaval also included a re-energized, predominantly white women's movement that was increasing its demands for equality, and increased efforts by women of color, those who stood at the intersection of race and sex discrimination, in their fight for emancipation from systems of both racism and patriarchy. The commission determined to focus its mission on only two of these issues, right? The civil rights movement and the spread of democracy, but it omitted any of the women's issues. It publicly stated its intent was to study the events surrounding and including the emancipation and their application to what it called the unfinished business of democracy, the distance yet to go to fulfill the goals and ideals of the Emancipation Proclamation. So the commission planned and supported events in cities throughout the state. The commission was composed of 16 men and 1 woman, Edith Sampson. Women, understand, served as staff for the commission. They did almost all of the groundwork to make the programs a success, but only Sampson was included in the public face of the commission. So who was Edith Sampson, right? She embodied all of the issues that were ripe for this period. She spent most of her adult life fighting for rights and dignities of African Americans by employing the gradualist philosophy. But by 1960, she was beginning to abandon that strategy in favor of more direct action. She had traveled the world as a representative for the United States government, urging the newly decolonized countries to adopt a democratic form of government, and had in turn used Asians' and Africans' concerns over U.S. racial policies as a means to effect race equality at home. Additionally, and perhaps most importantly for purposes today, Edith Sampson had worked to join women of color from around the world together to fight for their full emancipation from racism and patriarchy. So my paper argues that Sampson's participation in the commission and the Centennial events represents the critical but limited way that African American women activists attempted to include the needs of women of color in the civil rights movement. Okay, so over the next few minutes, I'm going to give you a brief history of Sampson's activism that informed her perspective in 1963. Briefly identify how activists and politicians used the Centennial to frame the issues of the day and set a course for the future, but how Sampson then complicated that agenda by inserting issues that affected women of color into the movement dominated by black men's concerns. And I'll conclude that Sampson had little success in changing the course of the civil rights movement during that period, but that her inclusion and her efforts laid a foundation for future generations of women of color. Okay, so Edith Sampson begins her career as a social worker in Pittsburgh, then New York, then in Chicago. When she's in Chicago, she attends law school, passes the bar, and joins the lawyer community in Chicago in 1927. Through her work of almost 30 years as a lawyer and a social worker, she said that she, quote, identified the need for service and the greater need for intelligent, honest, and fearless Negro leadership. And so that's what she dedicated her life to. She excelled in the practice of law, and more importantly, she developed political connections in Chicago and then later nationally. And after Roger's paper this morning, I'm going to really explore that much more deeply in the future. While she was practicing law, Sampson was also an activist for women of color. She served as a leader in the National Council of Negro Women. This is the organization that Mary McLeod Bethune founded in 1935 to bring together the voices of black women from around the country in order to organize their efforts and increase their collective power. And this was very conscious, right? It was an organization for African American women because Bethune understood that the needs of black women were distinct from the needs of black men and white women, and that black women must unite in order to have power. She said, quote, "We need a unified organization to open new doors for our young women. We need a vast council of women, and when that council speaks, its power will be felt." Sampson was an early member of this organization. She became a leader. She fought for the presidency and lost when Bethune retired, and she helped to shape and carry out its civil rights agenda. The aim of the National Council of Negro Women was always, quote, "the complete integration of Negro women into the American Commonwealth with all normal rights and privileges." So at the end of World War II, Sampson began her work uniting African American women with women of color from around the world. She joined a long tradition of women of color engaged in international coalition activism. It began in the late 19th century. It increased during the interwar years. Particularly through the International Council of Women of the Darker Races, which was founded in 1922 by Margaret Murray Washington, who was Booker T. Washington's widow at that point. Mary McLeod Bethune was a member, and the National Council of Negro Women and the International Council of Women of the Darker Races worked together to hold conferences for women of color, reaching countries that included Cuba, the Philippines, Liberia, Mexico, Costa Rica, France, China, Haiti, Great Britain, Belgium, the list goes on. Their aim was consistently to fight for women of color's liberty and equality. Bethune explained, quote, "Negro women, like all other women, must take part in building this world." In 1949, Edith Sampson gets tapped to participate in a town hall world seminar. This was an extension of the town hall radio programs that had been holding meetings throughout the United States. Now they're going to extend this to the world. And the program's distinct technically from the State Department, but there's some collusion going on here. And it's a propaganda campaign, right, to spread democracy to these new countries. Sampson was one of the 28 seminars. There were only 2 African Americans. She was the only African American woman. Radical African American activists harshly criticized Sampson for participating in this, right? She's a puppet of the state by doing this. But Sampson didn't see it that way. She used this opportunity to reach out to women of color around the world. And the organizers tried to keep race and gender out of this, right? Just talk about how great democracy is. But the people that they went and talked to in the Middle East and in Asia wouldn't let that stand, right? And Edith Sampson was the only obvious person of color. The other person of color on the tour was Walter White, the executive secretary of the NAACP, and many of you know he was very light-skinned, blue eyes, and people in Asia didn't know he was black, right? So they all looked at Sampson, who had much darker skin, stood out, and they said, "Is there race equality in the United States?" And at first they wouldn't let her answer, but by the time they got to New Delhi, Sampson had had enough, and she said, "I'll answer that question. No, there is not racial equality in the United States." But then she talked about gradualism and incremental advances and how democracy is still better than communism. But she also turned that strategy then on the State Department, and she called on the U.S. government to act. She said, quote, "From an international standpoint, we in the United States must realize the importance of cleaning up our own backyard. The countries of the world are looking to America for leadership and democracy. We must set an example. We will not win their confidence, especially the confidence of Asia's dark-skinned millions, if they continue to read about the discriminatory practices in America. Therefore, I say democracy's best answer to communism is to practice what it preaches, but fast." So Sampson used these opportunities on the tour and then after to reach out to women of color. Her message was consistent, and it was twofold. She called on the U.S. to end race discrimination at all levels immediately, and she called for women of color to unite locally, nationally, and internationally to ensure that their voices were heard and that they would help shape the new social order. So back to the political connections, India Edwards, who is an advisor for President Truman says, hey, you got to pay attention to Edith Sampson. So he says, okay, and picks her to be a representative to the United Nations in 1950. Some dismissed her appointment as part of this propaganda effort, but Sampson didn't see it that way. She said this is an opportunity. Other women of color saw that too. For example, Polly Murray, an African-American woman lawyer and activist, wrote to Sampson offering her support and assistance and explained that she was, quote, deeply aware of how much this appointment means to you and to us. She didn't have to say who the us was. Everybody understood. Sampson carried this work forward in her position. She traveled extensively throughout the 1950s in the U.S. and around the world. I mean, Scandinavia, Central Europe, England, Turkey, Pakistan, Egypt, Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, Syria, Venezuela, Colombia, Peru, Chile, Argentina, Brazil. You get the picture. But the acts of grave social injustice that were increasing in the States made Sampson turn from her gradualist approach, and she began to have increased demands for direct action. She said, quote, 360 million people in India, the 100 million people in Pakistan, the 80 million people in Japan, and countless millions in other parts of the East are watching. Everywhere I travel, the question was the same. What about Little Rock? What about Emmett Till, dead in Mississippi, his murderers graciously set free by an all-white jury? So it's this Edith Sampson that comes to serve on the commission and participate in the Emancipation Proclamation Centennial events. Black leaders had advocated for the inclusion of African Americans in these celebrations. They wanted to ensure that they accurately depicted the history and certain circumstances of African Americans, and to ensure that the focus was not looking at how far Negroes have come in the past 2 decades, but how far they have to go. African Americans filled their speeches with demands that America live up to its ideals of freedom and equality. As Martin Luther King said, there is but one way to commemorate the Emancipation Proclamation. That is to make its declaration of freedom real, to reach back to the origins of our nation when our message of equality electrified an unfree world, and reaffirm democracy by deeds as bold and as daring as the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. President Kennedy, by June of 1963, got the message, right? His ceremonial remarks at the Lincoln Memorial months earlier had a tone of encouragement, but his speech in June included an indictment and a warning to Americans. 100 years of delay, he said, have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves, yet their heirs and their grandsons are not fully free. And he goes on to mention Birmingham and the trouble in the streets, both in the North and the South, and he says, redress is sought in the streets and demonstrations, parades, and protests, which create tensions, threaten violence, and threaten lives. So these centennial celebrations were intended to address these issues, but also they were directed by the State Department to include this message of democracy. This was an important part of these centennial celebrations. The official directive was to support a democratic form of government and expose the, quote, lie to communist propaganda that used the continuing race discrimination in the United States as a reason to reject American-style democracy. African Americans said, okay, we're not going to take your directive. We're paying attention to the dramatic advances of Asian and African peoples and their growing influence in world affairs. And this is why the black leaders in Chicago pick Edith Sampson to be on the commission. Cornel Davis, who's the chair of the commission, and William Robinson, who's the vice chair of the commission, they're both representatives in the Illinois General Assembly, explained to Sampson, quote, "We are in total agreement that you bring to this occasion a wealth of experience unequaled by anyone we could otherwise select. Your world point of view and observations concerning our way of life communicated to you from representatives of other cultures from around the world endow you with an unusual insights in commenting and making observations on the meaning and significance of the historical Emancipation Proclamation." Right? Everybody got it. So they have Sampson be the featured speaker at almost every one of the events, the only woman that was allowed to speak, and she didn't disappoint. She talked about all the issues that she had talked about on the road. But she added the issue of women of color's emancipation and the need to include women of color's issues in the civil rights movement. Her prominent presence on the commission and the fact that she was featured as a speaker gave part of that message. But black women were otherwise conspicuously absent from the public face of the civil rights movement. In 1963, black women had been part of the civil rights movement for decades, perhaps a century, depending how long, when you want to start the movement. There was a big debate at a conference about that. Many scholars today assert that there were even more women civil rights activists in the movement than men. They did the everyday maintenance of the movement, right? But their work was devalued and they were kept out of sight. And this was made really prominent in the March on Washington in June of 1963, and I think Rogers alluded to this earlier. No African-American women were allowed to speak at the march. Many of them spoke out. Lots of them were angry. Pauli Murray is one of the most outspoken critics. She said that she understood black women's important contribution to the movement, and she characterized the actions of male leaders of the march as, quote, a backlash of a new male aggressiveness against Negro women, and described the result of this type of behavior as, quote, an affront to black women's personal dignity. The general tenor of a male-dominated society has grave consequences for Negro women, she said. And Murray urged her audience of black women to demand that the civil rights movement include in its agenda equal opportunity without regard to sex in training, education, and employment at every level. Sampson was a little bit more diplomatic when she echoed this statement the following year in 1964 in Washington, D.C., at a tribute to Eleanor Roosevelt. She praised the First Lady for consulting and developing friendships with black women as part of her civil rights work, and she said, quote, "Only a woman of color can relate to you what it means to be a Negro in our country." So, in conclusion, Edith Sampson ended her career as a judge in Cook County. After the Centennial, she remained active in national and international affairs. It's important, and I don't have time to go into it, about how close she was to the presidents and the first ladies, and this is another thing I'm going to explore more after this. She served on national committees at the request of Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. In 1968, just 2 months before his assassination, Robert F. Kennedy sent a telegram to Sampson where he asked her to help him rebuild our party and redirect our nation. Sampson retired from the bench in 1978, died the following year. Her life and activism, like so many others of her generation, must be recounted. As Jackie Hogan said earlier today, it is important not to perpetuate the distortion that African American women were not active in the civil rights movement and that they didn't matter and that their issues weren't important. Sampson, I argue, laid the foundation for the women that come after her, and that maybe is particularly important here at the 150th anniversary. Thank you.